Hello again, book lovers, and here I'm going to tell you what I thought of The Witches by Stacy Schiff. This isn't about witches in general, it's not a broad sweep history. The subtitle will give that away, the subtitle being Salem 1692. Yes, it all takes place in 1 year, pretty much some 200 years after the arrival of Europeans into the continent. Here we find Massachusetts, we find New England. In fact, if you didn't know, you'd think it was England. You've got Essex, you've got Andover, you've got Boston, and we're focusing on this outbreak of madness. I don't think anybody now believes that witches flew through the air and wrought destruction. But here we have an appropriately sized history. If you want to dig into it, you've got 400 pages, plus the usual references. I've not read Stacy Schiff before. The cover recommendation from the Times says, J.K. Rowling meets Anthony Beaver, Stephen King, Marina Warner, Schiff's writing is to die for. That kind of worried me a little bit, but don't worry, it's not over-florid or excessive, and there are some nice little arch comments peppered throughout the text without deflecting from the main agenda. And the main agenda is what? It began when some young girls began to have convulsions, claimed that they were victims of witchcraft. And I think the story is pretty well known if you've seen The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which is a great play in my opinion. Perfect subject matter for it. And I had a very entertaining time reading this, mulling over, as we all must do, what could possibly have caused such an outbreak of madness. An outbreak of madness similar to that recorded in The Devils of Loudun by Aldous Huxley, my particular favourite of the things of his that I've read. And there he describes a similar outbreak of madness, which descends into torture. Here, of course, officially there wasn't any torture, although berating 70-year-old women for hours on end and sticking pins in them might, in some people's opinion, be considered such. Or chucking people, whether they're pregnant women, old women, young children, into a stinking, airless dungeon for months on end, just because they've been accused by an imaginative adolescent of some horrible things. And all the way through, you think to yourself, I can't understand how this happened. Could they not see the total illogicality of it? If these witches could do whatever they wanted, why did they do things like trip up horses or rob cabbages? Or even if they're supposed to have flown into somebody's room and stuck pins into them, why not, I don't know, do something worse? There are trial manuscripts here, although a lot of them got lost, where we find first questions along the lines of, why did you do it? Rather than, did you do it? And also the impossibility of fighting against this wall of righteousness. Lots of legal discussions on whether the touch test, when the accused would quieten the afflicted by touching them, was applicable. These girls would fly off into fits if the accused even looked at them, so in some of the cases they just had to not look at these young ladies. And it's quite a close-knit community, they all kind of knew each other. People were accusing people in the same household, husbands to wives, children to parents. A truly terrible episode, and well worth reading. You become very well acquainted with the main characters. With the women characters you get your usual Rebeccas, Janes and Marys, but the men are resplendent with names like Cotton, Deodat, Increase, and my favourite, Wait Still Winthrop. And we very soon dive into the internal politics of the village. And Miss Schiff does a good breakdown by gender at the end as to who accused who, which is interesting. One surprising thing that I found in the book is how quickly it all died down, and how quickly the recriminations began, and how quickly the covering up began. We get the mini biographies at the end of how people ended up, and a lot of the religious people that took part in it didn't do well, let's say. There was one young girl who was sort of let back into the community many years later, and they have a seating arrangements in the churches as well, so they get sat next to people according to where the preacher thinks they should sit. And so she got sat next to the daughter of somebody whose mother had been killed on her orders, so that must have been a bit peculiar. Reminded me also of another of my all-time favourite books, Great Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, in which the witch mania is discussed, and a lot of it centering on an outbreak in Sweden, which was used almost as a blueprint for the Salem trials, despite the fact that a lot of the young girl accusers had recanted. Still, the same leitmotifs appear. Not broomsticks, but poles. They go flying on poles. And again, a nice analysis by our author of which features overlapped and which were new. All in all, a great slice of already well-known but still fascinating history, put under the microscope and well told. We don't get so much at the beginning, but as the history evolves, we realise that a lot of the real spectres were the Indian tribes that were surrounding and would often raid the villages, or the French, who were not well liked at all in those parts. And then again there was the tensions even with the British, and those goddamn Quakers, they were worst. So you see, they were kind of surrounded by enemies, and the mindset that they had in a way led them to eat themselves alive. A nice little code tells us about some of the descendants of this business. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about it. He introduced a W into his name to distance himself from the people involved, the Haythorns. And the list also features American presidents, Revolutionary War heroes, Louisa May Alcott, Walt Disney, and Lucille Ball. Nowadays, if you go there, you'll see the Witch on the Broomstick as a kind of jocular folk reference to these terrible events. They were, after all, over 300 years ago. But it's a story worth reading, even though at the back of your mind, all the time perplexed at how this sort of madness could descend as if from the clouds and affect these communities in such irrational ways. So, a book worth reading and a moral tale worth remembering.